I got the warning.
I'm just going to go ahead and start the webinar as well. It's almost 5:30. Okay, it's officially 5:30. Started the webinar, and this is a recording. I'll give it another about a minute till the attendees come in. Then I will start with the presentation.
How about you see the option to allow them to talk?
Yes.
Okay. Would you like to manage that or me? I want to help you.
Once we get to the questions and answers, I think I can go through here and allow them to talk. If I
Sounds
can't
good.
find it, I'll go ahead and ask you. But I think for now it should be fine.
Okay.
Okay, we will go ahead and get started with this community meeting. Thank you everybody for coming. I'm Rosalba Ramirez, the Deputy Director of Public Works here in the town of Yountville. And I will go ahead and be sharing my screen and doing a presentation. So I'll start by sharing my screen. Again, this is being recorded and this is a webinar. I'm going to present first and then open it up to questions and answers. I'll be looking for a hand raised after my presentation or checking the chat box for any questions. Okay, can everybody see my presentation?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, this is a community outreach meeting for the ADA accessibility parking at Forrester Park and Weirs Park. If you have questions during the meeting and you put them in the chat box, I won't read them until the end of the presentation. It's not a very long presentation, so we do have plenty of time for questions and answers. I did want to start out the presentation with doing a refresher on what this project is. This project is currently budgeted in our capital improvements program. We received grant funding for it, TDA grant funds, about $160,000 for the design and construction. The scope of work includes one accessible parking stall at each location. So one accessible stall at Weirs Park and one accessible stall at Forrester Park. I just want to emphasize, and it was on the flyer and all the press releases we sent out, that this is not a project to construct sidewalks along the streets in this neighborhood. This is only for one accessible parking stall at each park. The remaining work for this project, after we get done with this meeting, is complete the design. And this includes going back to council to have improved the design before we do anything with construction. Most likely some additional community outreach. And we do anticipate this project budget to be low enough to be an informal bid. So once we do get approval from the town council to proceed with the advertisement of the project, the advertisement period does not have to be as long as a formal project. So that could expedite the ability to construct these two stalls. The project need. And so again, this project is just to install one parking stall at each location for accessibility. And this is part of the American with Disabilities Act, us trying to be compliant with the requirements of that act to provide accessible facilities to everybody. The parks and the pedestrian trails. And this coincides with our own Town of Yountville self-evaluation and transition plan. So as part of that ADA accessibility, Americans with Disability Act, we have a self-evaluation and transition plan that specifically calls out Forrester Park and Weirs Parks as part of our plan to provide accessibility. And these projects were called out in years 1 and through 4, and we are currently now in year 7, but during that time we were able to at least secure funds and meet some of the requirements of us trying to move forward with providing accessibility at these two locations. So included in that need with the accessibility act in providing the parking stalls is not just access to the park itself, but access to the trails that lead into those parks and that connect to the rest of the town. What you see here is our Yarnville Parks and Paths mapped, and you can see the paths lead to Three Weirs Park and Forrester Park. At Three Weirs Park, we have that pedestrian bridge that crosses the creek, and that bridge leads to Hopper Creek Path, which leads to accessible sidewalk, which leads to other parts of town. And that's one of the components why it's important to provide that accessible stall at Three Weirs Park, so that accessibility is provided to that bridge that connects to the path, that connects to the accessible sidewalk, that connects to the rest of town. Along with Forrester Park, the trail leads around Forrester Park, so providing that accessibility with a parking stall provides accessibility to the path on that end as well. I'll go into the renderings for each location. So this is the ramp or the parking stall at Three Weirs Park. It's a little bit more than just a stall because we have that pedestrian bridge that's higher than the road currently is. There was a high grade at that park, and that's why the ramp you see here is needed, a ramp with rails. So yes, there's a little bit more concrete work at this park. We try to make the impact as minimal as possible, but still provide the ADA compliant accessibility to the pedestrian bridge. And again, this is a rendering, but we are trying to match different looks around town at different parks and provide the wooden planks along the ramp as opposed to just pure concrete. This is still conceptual, still in design. We may still have some changes, but this is what our current design could look like. And at Forrester Park, a little bit more straightforward. We just went into the existing landscaping area. So we'd be pushing back the current landscaping, that current sign, connecting to the existing ADA ramp that's there and providing that ADA accessible stall so they can access the pedestrian path in the park and the park facilities as well. And that really wraps up the presentation. I'll leave this accessible to us. So if questions want to flip through another slide, if anybody has questions, I can go through. I will leave it at the rendering slide, and let me stop sharing so I can see if there are any questions. Okay, I see one hand raised, and I will allow to talk and make sure you are unmuted. This is Kathy Ainsworth. Kathy, okay.
Yeah, okay. You know, we've lived here the 25 years in Washington Park. So I'm curious, have we been mandated for the 25 years to put these stalls in and we're just getting to it now? Or is this, you know, through the years, rules and regs have changed? And interestingly, our O'Brien developers, you know, put the parking bays. We are a little bit elevated in our parking bays because when you park in front of our houses or in front of the parks, you're supposed to be off the road. So there's no sidewalks, you end up walking in the street. I'm curious to know if we had gone with another concept, like, you know, Vandeleur Park has no parking bays. They're just no parking. There's nothing for wheelchair access because they're flat. And this O'Brien's second group has the curbs. So I'm just wondering how all this came about out of curiosity.
Well, with the different ADA compliant regulations, it does change over time, and over at least the last 25 years, they have changed, not just with parking accessibility, but the way we build different paths and do different construction projects. Part of that transition plan is trying to be compliant with those changes. So in general, people know that you can't, towns and cities can't just go in and put the money towards making all these changes to make everything ADA compliant as things have changed over the years. But we have that plan in place to try to address issues as we can. And we did, and there are funding available. So we received funding to try to address these issues, to make these compliant. And then as far as the bay and not just curb adjacent in this area, we did push the stall into the bay because of the width of the street. So we're trying to also provide that ADA accessibility so they're not coming out into the street, but also provide enough room for vehicles to drive through.
Okay,
Raise your hand again.
I'm still up. My husband Charles has a
I
question.
think I got a simple question, sorry. If Weir Park wasn't a designated park, would we still be required to put an ADA parking spot if it was not a park?
Greenville.
The big, I guess, connection to putting this ADA stall at this park in particular is that pedestrian bridge that connects to the path. So by this stall will not only connect to the park, but it'll have an ADA compliant path up to that pedestrian bridge that crosses to the Hop Creek path.
So the labeling it as a park doesn't require you to put up a ADA parking spot.
Not necessarily, it's the different components that are part of this particular park.
All right, good enough.
Rosalba, if you would let Steve Rogers speak next, he can provide some history about the neighborhood and answer that first question. And he's got his hand up in the audience.
I will allow Steve to talk now.
Thank you, Rosalba, John, and to the crowd that is here. Many of you might remember several years ago, we had a conversation, and I think, Kathy, you brought up the accurate statement that we have raised parking shoulders, and that originally this O'Brien development was designed to mimic Old Town, or as you mentioned, Vandeleur Park, level
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
We'll give Steve a second. I think he might have some audio issues.
All right. So when the project was developed, it was not supposed to have sidewalks. It was supposed to walk, talk. We had a major community discussion, and there was a commitment made by the town 5-6 years ago, maybe a little longer, that we would focus on only doing the minimum necessary for ADA compliance and the network connectivity, because people did not want to treat, there was some folks at that point in time asking about sidewalk connectivity and then putting sidewalks in place. And that did not go over well in the neighborhood, and the town made the commitment. So what we have here is, at this point, we've been, it's in our ADA transition plan, and we're honoring the commitment that was made at that point in time and going slow. And here we're working on providing the minimum level of accessibility and disrupting as little as we can to the core character of the raised parking shoulders. And I do think, Chuck and Kathy, you're right. The raised parking shoulders make for a very interesting, odd situation, because we've had complaints of residents tripping and falling off of the shoulders. But that's a little bit of history that predates Rosalba and John, and a little bit of what we're trying to do here. And then really what we're trying to do is provide for an accessible connection. All of our parks have ADA parking, and Forrester Park is a neighborhood park, and there is a need to provide connectivity. The Weirs Park, which is named for a flood control device that is located in that proximity, is the neighborhood connector to the regional Hopper Creek path. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of history and context for some of the folks here. And again, our commitment here is just to do the minimum approach necessary to comply with the ADA and our transition plan and provide accessibility at these locations.
Thank you so much.
Before you speak, Rosalba, sorry for interrupting. I would also like to point out that Mayor Dunbar and Councilmember Eric Knight are in the audience and are participating in this meeting as well.
Now with that, I'll go ahead and let Mayor Dunbar speak, as he has his hand raised.
I had to unmute here. I can't see myself, so I'm assuming you can hear me at this point. But two other things I wanted to add to Steve's historical recollection. One was originally all the parking bays were gravel, and the residents did not like that, as it was all tracked into their homes and was making a mess. And that was one of the other features that was a carryover from the old town style. Sounds charming, and it turns out it's a logistical nightmare. The other thing people need to realize in Washington Park, the Ainsworth beat me by a year. I've only been here 24 years, but the side streets are meant to funnel water. When we used to have heavy rains and floods, side streets were to have water flow to Forrester Lane, and Forrester Lane would run the full length of the neighborhood and deposit floodwaters into Beer Ditch. That didn't work with the gravel flat sidewalks, even the gravel raised sidewalks. And so it was also part of the flood network to modify with the asphalt along the, you call it sidewalks, parking bays, whatever. We have not had ADA compliance in Washington Park for these 2+ decades. We used to have wooden dirt pathways until we made them concrete. And we're probably way behind making these ADA improvements, but they're not just ADA improvements. They're actually mobility improvements for all levels. We have plenty of families with young children that are pushing strollers that are having a hard time navigating because we don't have the full connectivity that we're talking about here. And so I appreciate that Chuck and Kathy are bringing up some of the historical information. That one of the reasons for that grass area that we're calling Three Weir Park is because it used to flood every year. And then we built that weir so it would not flood frequently. But there was a space there just in the design of the neighborhood that needed to be left open, partly because it's a flood prone section. So it's definitely appropriate that we are providing ADA accessibility, especially in these two locations, because they are publicly accessible public facilities. It is not just about accessing our houses, but it is accessing public facilities. We call them facilities, even though they're parks, but it is publicly owned space.
Thank you, Mayor. I will go ahead and answer a question from the question and answer box from Carrie Hayes. Two-part question. So here I did not introduce our consultant designer from Vent Engineering is Carlton. So he's here just in case to answer questions that, to help me if I can't answer something regarding the ADA compliance and the design that we showed. And then the second part of your question, Carrie, is the sloped access, the current sloped access to the pedestrian bridge, is that currently out of compliance? And that is yes, not severely out of compliance, but if we build a new connection or path to it and do not update it to be compliant, it won't be compliant. So that's why we have to do this change, and that's why I see the ramp sloping up, because it currently is not compliant. Okay, and I'll go down my list. I have Kimberly Cook. I will allow to talk. Okay, Kimberly, if you can unmute.
Hi, here I am. Couple different questions. Have you considered, instead of putting access for the Hopper Creek path in front of Three Weir Park, have you considered making ADA compliant parking spaces at the other ends of Hopper Creek Park, like a space on Fennell or a space on Yount Street, instead of creating this large industrial looking construction on Three Weirs Park?
And the components to ADA, different components to ADA compliance and why Three Weir Park is that it is on that side of the creek. So Fennell currently does have sidewalks and parking along it. Yount Street has sidewalks and parking along it. It's this interior area that we want to make sure we provide access to those who are maybe in that area or that side of town, for them to park and use that bridge to cross and use a creek path there. We can look into it more though and see what kind of parking is around that whole area. And talk to, our engineers and our town manager regarding the impacts this stall might have at that park. But that was,
Because anybody who was looking for that path would see it from Yonge Street or Fresnel, and sending them into a neighborhood to find a park, to unload their car, to walk over the bridge to get to that path is very convoluted and doesn't seem necessary. And the park itself has no special features. So access to that park isn't really necessary. You're saying access to the bridge, but isn't it really access to that pathway that we're looking for?
a little bit of both, but we also don't want to make determinations on what we considered, what we want to give access to. So we will look into, again, the design, how it's impacting the park and the neighborhood. But we also want to make sure that we're not following ADA compliant rules by determining that certain facilities don't need to be accessible.
But that
especially
is part
in
of,
our current evaluation plan.
but that
we will
is
look into it.
part of the ADA, that is part of the ADA rules, is that not every park has to be accessible. This one has no special features. And so this is my concern about the one at Three Ware Park is it's so industrial looking. It's the biggest, ugliest thing that will be in the Washington Park neighborhood. And it really doesn't suit the neighborhood at all.
And we will look into the current design. This isn't, again, these are concepts we wanted to bring
Okay.
forward. So we will look into the design. And like I said, town council will have final approval before we go out there, and we'll most likely have some form of community outreach before we do any final design. But this is just kind of the initial, here's what we're looking at. And so we
Okay.
will get more feedback before we move
Okay.
forward with construction.
I would also, this is purpose of the meeting is to get this kind of feedback on the size and shape of it and the visual impact of it. Additionally, the access point at Three Weirs Park is an access point for the entire neighborhood. So yes, it's another access to the path, but it's also an access point for that entire neighborhood. Whereas they'd have to go out to Yount Street or out to Fennell to access the path if we didn't provide access there.
Okay, another question do you know how many participants there are in this meeting that are from the neighborhood? If you take you guys out?
I couldn't say for sure. I have about 14, not including us, participants total.
Okay,
But it doesn't give me addresses, so I wouldn't be able to
Okay.
tell you who specifically lives in that neighborhood.
because I know of a couple people, like that street only has about 3 houses that have permanent residents, and everything else is a vacation house. But I know one of the permanent residents who is right across the street from that park doesn't know how to Zoom and doesn't know anything about this other than the flyer.
And
So if you want to, I know it was great to see all the flyers handed out, but perhaps a large board with a picture of what you're doing posted in the park, like when the paving project happened. There was a big sign in that park of what you were going to do. And I think that would also maybe help catch some of the second homeowners that only come up once in a while, could see it, that might have missed the meeting.
Okay, that's actually really good advice. So with this presentation, I'll have this online as well. And maybe when we send out additional flyers or paperwork, we'll look into doing some sort of message board or some sort of graphics for those who aren't comfortable with using Zoom or the internet.
Okay.
Try to get them to be able to get a look at those renderings as well.
Yeah. One last simple question. Will these 2 improvements make it so that those current ADA, this is not an ADA compliant neighborhood, be removed? Or is it still an ADA non-compliant neighborhood?
That's the-
It remains non-compliant because of the configuration of the parking strips. So these 2 improvements are ADA access to public facilities but the entire neighborhood is still ADA non-compliant, so the signs will remain.
Okay, those are all my questions for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, and I will go to Steve Cook, allowed to talk.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a question, I think both for John and Carlton. Had any consideration been given to orienting the parking space perpendicular to the street to minimize the carve out and disruption to existing parking for the egress in and out of arcing in, where the parking space would be a pull-in straight space, and that we'd be leaving more of the existing parking for the non-ADA visitors to the park?
So
On those weekends at the park, on the weekends that Forrester Park gets used, the street gets quite a few cars, and it seems like we would leave more of that parking still accessible if that ADA space was a pull-in essentially the same space between the two sidewalk access, but if it was a straight pull-in spot as the parking spaces are at the Oak Circle Park.
And again, these are, preliminary designs that we're looking at, but we did want to minimize the impacts to the existing parks. And Forrester Park in that area does have existing light poles, some electrical work, and some utilities that we were trying to not have to relocate. That increases the scope of work and the cost of the project. But this again is a preliminary design. This is what we first want to bring forward. So we will take your comments into consideration and see if that could work, and if it does make more sense, and if we could still keep it within the project budget.
Yeah, because it seems like having the access to be able to pull in and access that parking space, the general public will lose 2 parking spaces of length on the street, just by the nature of that, or the way that's oriented.
Okay, we will definitely take a look into that.
And a question that kind of follows up on the talking about the parking shoulders, whatever we call it. For Steve, if the neighborhood remains non-ADA compliant, are we saying that these changes are not the triggering event for the entire neighborhood that we've all been trying to work, or that you're helping us work around and stay away from? Is it not, how is it not a triggering event?
Well, using your words, Steve, we're taking effort to protect and minimize the risk from an ADA issue for the public facilities. The neighborhood still has an ADA risk where somebody could potentially make an allegation that the raised paved parking shoulders are non-ADA compliant, and therefore, but we're staying very consistent with the commitment that was made that we would not go forward with a comprehensive sidewalk plan, but would look at 3 things. 2 of them are these 2 improvements to the park. And I certainly think there's some ideas on how the parking space is allocated that we can certainly look at from a design standpoint. And the 3rd potential area that's still out there ultimately at some point is connecting the Forrester path along the vineyard up to Vista at some point, but that is still further out. And those were the 3 areas that the town committed to doing and then maintaining. And we've improved, as I think somebody earlier mentioned, the town has paved and concreted the existing walkways through the middle of the neighborhood that provide connectivity out. So again, we're staying very consistent to those commitments. And it does not remove the concern about overall ADA lack of compliance as far as a mobility network. So that still remains. And as John Ferens mentioned, the signage would still have to stay. But really, it's to provide the fact that if somebody is to come attempt to access, utilize the park facilities, that we are ADA capable. I also want to point out to Kim's earlier question, as you're wandering around town, you will notice that there are ADA parking spaces, obviously at Yountville Community Park, Veterans Memorial Park, Oak Circle Park, which is also a connector to the Hopper Creek Path. We also have a ADA spot at the Vineyard Park. There's also an ADA parking spot on both sides of Heather accessing the Hopper Creek Path. So there's been significant effort on the part of the town to make sure that we are compliant and in other neighborhoods as well. So those efforts are consistent. And again, I think when you see the renderings, we're really trying just to make sure that we're only putting in one ADA accessible parking spot, leaving the rest as undisturbed, consistent with the current layout as we can. There's some feedback that I think will allow us to play around with a couple different designs. And obviously the ADA path at Three Weirs Park connecting in is not an accessible slope. So we do need to start addressing that.
Okay, kind of a follow-up to Kim's earlier comment about some people aren't participating in the meeting, or from watching Kim do the ZDRB things, that some people can't read plans like you guys all can and see how it's going and visualize it. Going forward, when you get closer to options, can there either be flagging, not story poles, but something that really shows a representation spatially for how these things are going to happen for the residents to see it? Because even the the artist rendering of what would happen at Three Weir Park isn't that easy or straightforward to see exactly the impact of which trees are gone or how that path integrates or how big the wall is. So just going forward, those kind of things would help the people who aren't here.
We will, I think, if many of you may recall, we posted renderings and of the work at Yountville Community Park. And as we get a little bit closer, we can certainly put a signboard at each location with some copies of what the proposed or options might be as we move forward. That is certainly doable.
Okay, well, yeah, it'd be interesting if there's other options, Carlton, to not having to carve out so much for the ramp and that retaining wall look at Three Weir Park, which just harshens up the whole look of the park. And there's a portion of that park that is almost street grade level that would seem to be, again, at a perpendicular type parking space that would allow it not to have that retaining wall harshness and the railing coming all the way down to the street. So that's my 2 cents of trying to minimize it, but still have it be accessible from both direction of travel on the street, but leaving us some of our existing parking for the weekenders that the overflow that won't use that space.
It's a shame they don't use their parking driveways and garages as well.
Well, yeah, okay.
I'm just saying, I hear you.
I'm there. I'm there. Being right next to the park, we'll have our driveway blocked on weekends. It's just what it is.
We'll take a look. You guys have given us, I think the participants in today's meeting have given us some thoughts so that we are able, and certainly we can commit to some visual rendering so that people have a better sense. And we struggle in any type of meeting, whether it's a Zoom webinar or an in-person meeting, as to who participates, chooses, and pays attention to the information we send. We're certainly very thankful and appreciative to those of you that are sharing your comment on this so that it allows us to move forward and hopefully put forward the best project that meets all of the shared goals and objectives.
Thank you. Good.
Rosalba, if I may, one thing that's important to note, the version that we showed you today for Three Weirs Park was an iteration that was worked on repeatedly, because in order to meet the ADA grades, and I'll defer to Carlton for the details of this, but in order to meet the ADA grades, without the retaining wall and the guardrail, it has a much larger footprint. So you end up with this serpentine path that runs through the park. And unfortunately, 3 of the trees, the mature trees that are there next to the parking strip, would be in the way and would be compromised, as well as irrigation infrastructure. So we did look at a different version, multiple versions that didn't have that retaining wall, guardrail, handrail feature to it, but the impact of the park was much greater.
And it may be, John, we need to show that as an alternative that was looked at, but ultimately not favored because of those concerns, so that the audience sees that. I think that may be good information for everybody to know that, you know, in this case, we've looked at some alternatives and didn't present them. So in fairness, that might not be a bad idea for us to showcase.
Okay, and I have another question on the Q&A, the chat from Carrie Hayes. It's very similar to what requests we've been receiving right now to view the various options side by side. So as we go through different options, we'll create the renderings and either do it with a new outreach that we do, if we hold another meeting, or put poster boards. And then the second part of our question is post poster boards in the park and show various options. We'll try to make sure that everybody has the ability to view the different renderings and options and design options we're looking at, and that may include the parks. I have Billy Hewitt, I will allow to talk.
Am I hearing? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having the meeting and clarifying a lot of issues. I just wanted, have a question about the parking spot here at Forrester Park, at the park. If that is rendered ADA, where will the workers who work in the park, where will they be able to park? There will be no further parking spot. And I'm just wondering if you could consider it more like what's in front of Community Hall, how you go in, I guess that's perpendicular. Seems like you made more parking places where there were 3 before, and now there are 4.
Yes,
Is that
the angled parking in front of the community center.
right?
We were able to do that there also due to the space and the width of the road. We will, I think we also already received a request to look into potential pull-in parking or perpendicular parking at Forrester. That is something we'll look into to see if that does allow us to save some parking stalls on the side. There's still parking allowed on the street. It just would be that one spot right in front of the sign in the landscaping area that would make accessible. That would have to be ADA compliant stall. But we will look into maybe changing the orientation of the stall and see if that works.
Right. I know there was parking on the street, but if you make that accessible, then you can't park on either side of it because you'll block the sidewalk.
We'll look
As
into
I understand it, as I'm.
So right now, the way we have it rendered is there's only one stall that pushes back the landscaping, put an ADA stall there. There's an existing ramp on either side that we'll connect to, and then the
Right.
rest of the parking is allowed, just not directly in front of the ramp because that's not legally allowed.
Right, right.
But we will look at the different options to see if there's a way to just have one pull-in spot, maybe save some of the other spots. But those ADA ramps will stay there, so parking is still not allowed in front of those ramps, even if we don't put an accessible parking stall here.
But right now, some of the maintenance workers have to drive trucks or other equipment into the park.
Oh, they will still have access to it. They use.
Okay, there's enough access left. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go to the Q&A again really quick. From Carrie Hayes, irrigation was mentioned, and so could the new design options include removing grass and somehow integrate the changes with also making water-wise design features. So one of the goals for all of our projects, especially if they impact how we might use water, is to make sure we're being conservative, that we're doing water conservation, whether it's removing grass, new grass, just trying to find drought tolerant features. We'll always incorporate those. So if we do any of that with this project, we'll definitely try to approach it with the idea of water conservation to make sure things are drought tolerant. And then I have another question from Erica and Larry Kincaid. Will trees be removed at both parks? If so, how many and will they be replaced? Forrester Park only has some landscaping we're going to push back. that in the rendering, you see just a little bit of landscaping pushed back, no trees. At 3 Weirs, the design that we showed right now was the least impactful design. So we were only removing 1 tree that is currently dead. So we moved it over to that location to save as many trees as we have there, and only have to get rid of that 1 tree that needs to be removed either way. Okay, and then I have another question from John Dunbar. I will allow to talk. Oh, hand just disappeared. Carrie Hayes, hand is up. I know I just answered some of your questions on the chat, so hand disappeared. Okay, hand back for John Dunbar.
Yes, I guess I was just too quick to take it down when you were calling on me. Thank you. Going back, first of all, I seriously doubt there's space on the side street to have angled parking, just knowing how narrow that street is since I live here and regularly pass through there. Not everyone parks appropriately with at least 2 wheels up on the parking bay, and then it gets very complicated. I know everybody on this call is in the neighborhood basically. But the other thing I want to mention about the 3 Weirs Park design, 2 things. One, when we're looking at raw graphics, even the quality of 3-dimensional and very advanced graphics, they always look very stark and very industrial. And even if we add fake people and fake landscaping, it doesn't look real. And we just need to be patient with the understanding, because we went through this probably most recently in Yountville Community Park, when there was a very quick response to the very first thing somebody would see, and they would hate it and say this is terrible, and not allow the full picture to be drawn. And so that's one caution. The other thing that I just want to mention is we will make sure that we are explaining why certain features are included. For example, as was discussed here, a retaining wall and or handrail to minimize the switchback necessary for the legal grade requirement for a wheelchair or even a stroller or somebody with mobility challenges. There's a certain angle you have to stay within, or you have to do the switchback crisscrossing, and it would take up significant space. The other thing we will be highlighting is if that retaining wall is also flood protection along the creek side, sometime, because it is a part of the creek that when we do have heavy rain can still be at risk of flooding. And then, as I said earlier, Forrester Lane is meant to take flood water, but when you live right near there, it's still a concern that overflow may happen. So we'll identify whether that wall also serves as a flood barrier, not just a retaining wall for the ramp design. And also, we will make sure that any landscaping we can add in to soften any features that are hardscape features, we will do, with the idea that we want to be water wise, like we are everywhere else. Maybe it's even, well, I won't get into the details of designing and how we would soften and mitigate, but we're very sensitive to all of those components. And I understand change after 25 years is going to be changed no matter what it looks like, but we do need to make some improvements to be compliant. Thanks.
Thank you. I have 2 questions in the chat box. However, the name isn't shown, it just says SL. So SL, issue with parking at Forrester Perpendicular Park is losing valuable parking space. And also from SL, there's not enough space to have angled parking at Forrester Park. Again, these are suggestions that we will look into. Not saying that we will put that type of parking there, but we are going to explore all the options we have to try to minimize the impact to the existing park, to the residents, and to the existing parking there. So we're going to try to see what option is best. If angled parking is put in there, it won't be on the street, it would have to cut into the parks. So that's what we will look into to see what's possible in this area and what's best for the area. And again, we'll bring any changes or options back to town council, back to the community for your review and opinions. I have one more hand up, Kimberly Cook. I will allow to talk.
Hi, thank you again, Rosalba. Going back to Three Ware Park, the idea of a long meandering path to get down is so much more appealing and fits with the neighborhood better. The 3 trees that are along the street that you're talking about, if they had to be removed in order to do that, those are those, I don't know the name of those trees, but they're the ones that keep their brown leaves all the way until spring. And then they fall and make a mess in spring. So they're not anybody in the neighborhood's favorite trees. And the back part of the park has all the beautiful oak trees and things. So I think a meandering path would be really much more neighborhood-like. And as for Forrester Park, you know, if you had to do some different sculpting to get a perpendicular space in, if it works, you know, you guys do the drawings. It's the back part of the park that everybody uses, not really the front part. They all go to the back where all the picnic tables are and the fun stuff. So if that works and leaves more parking on the street, the important part is the back part. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have no more questions in the chat and no more hands raised. If you have any additional questions after this, something pops up, feel free to reach out to Public Works. You can reach me at rramirez@wyville.com. My contact information is on the flyer, or call our Public Works Department 707-944-8851. We still have to complete the design, run a past council, do some community outreach. So you won't be surprised with construction settling in the neighborhood without knowing what's going to go on. So we will be checking back in with the community. I will check in with all the panelists, see if anybody has any last comments or statements to make. I have one more hand raised from Kimberly Cook. Let me allow to talk. Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you for doing this. Thank you for listening and welcoming all our comments and being willing to work with us in the neighborhood. There's not a whole lot of people that still live here full time in the neighborhood, but we do appreciate your help and your consideration because to us, this is home. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for participating in the meeting. And I have one more hand that went up from Erica and Larry Kincaid.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just want to thank Kim for what she just said, and I thank you all for what you're doing. We appreciate it very much. It's just a side note, and I want to mention that my mom lived on Redwood Drive for many years, and she was wheelchair bound, and we never had an issue with the sidewalks the way they were. And I know that doesn't have any relevance to what we're talking about today, but I just wanted to let you know that it was never an issue for her. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Okay. I have no more questions in the chat box or any hands raised. So I will go ahead and end this meeting. And again, we will make this PowerPoint and presentation available on our Public Works website. Thank you, everybody.